Welcome to you all from around the world. We have a unique and rarely mentioned topic today, NATO Unclassified, an inside story. Been looking forward to this for a long time. And the story will be told by a major NATO official you'll meet in a couple of moments, with commentary from experts from Israel and Morocco. And we are therefore looking forward to a very intriguing discussion and set of information. Our Center for Middle East Development, CMED, is sponsoring today's event. And our co-sponsors are, from UCLA, the Luskin Department of Public Policy, the Berkel Center for International Relations, and the Center for European and Russian Studies, as well as from Prague, the Forum 2000 Foundation. And now, I am delighted to introduce the moderator of today's event, Ambassador Tomáš Pojar. Ambassador Pojar is Vice President for International Relations of the Prague-based Civro Institute and a defense, security, and foreign affairs consultant. From 2010 until 2014, Tomáš Pojar served as ambassador of the Czech Republic to the State of Israel. Prior to his posting, he served as the first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for Security, EU, and Bilateral Relations with European states, as well as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for Bilateral Relations. Ambassador Pojar joined the Czech Foreign Service in 2005 after he had been working as an executive director of the People in Need Czech TV Foundation, a person respected around the world. We are so pleased to have Tomáš with us. Welcome, Tomáš Pojar.
Thank you very much, Steve. I do welcome everyone from Prague, Czech Republic, from Central of Europe, and from Czech Republic, which is a proud NATO member state for already 22 years, or almost 22 years. And I'm delighted to chair this panel. And let me now say what is going to be, what is on the agenda. It's going to be about NATO and NATO and Middle East. We will have NATO headquarters speaker, and then on the day of re-establishment or establishment of relations between Morocco and Israel, two speakers from Morocco and Israel, which we planned in advance, and coincidentally, it's been happening today, which is, I guess, for many welcome news, and I hope for a lot welcome news. I will introduce the speakers one by one. The keynote speaker will speak for about 20 minutes. Then each of the commentators will have 5 to 10 minutes for their comments, and then there's going to be time for your questions. As Mani said, please send the questions through the Q&A box and sign them, your name and your country. I will read them to the panelists. If there's going to be more questions, I can put them into some package. And if we have a lot of questions, we have 90 minutes for our session. So there is going to be plenty of time after the speakers to get to the questions. So I encourage you to send the questions as soon as possible. Without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Giovanni Romani, who is currently head of NATO Middle East and North Africa section at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, in Belgium. He's a former Italian Navy officer in an active duty from 1985 to 2006. He served as combat operations, electronic warfare and intelligence officer on several Italian and US ships, also taking part in the Sharp Fence and Sharp Guard operations in waters adjoining the former Republic of Yugoslavia in the Mediterranean. In March 2006, Mr. Romani was appointed head of NATO's Naval Armament Unit, and then from April 2012 to December 2017, he led the Land and Maritime Capabilities section within the NATO Defense Investment Division. Giovanni speaks Italian, English, Spanish, and French. I will ask him, please speak in English that we can all understand you, what you are saying. And Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope you can hear me well. And Good morning and good evening for those who, like me, are in Europe. Here it's past 8 p.m. So if you see a kid going around in his pajama, it's my son. Don't worry too much about it. It's a pleasure for me to address you at this webinar. Thanks again for the invitation. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with NATO, so I would like to start by introducing the organization before I dive into the NATO MENA, Middle East and North Africa dimension. So the NATO is one of the world's major international institutions. It is a political and military alliance, bringing together 30 member countries from Europe and North America. They cooperate in the field of security and defense. The main objective of the alliance is the protection of its members through political and military means. And each member country has a permanent delegation here in NATO quarters. NATO is also active in civil emergency planning, helping allies and partners to cope with disasters, as well as promote cooperation in the field of science and the environment. While a lot of people will just think we only deal with the military. So NATO was created just 5 years after the end of the Second World War by 12 founding nations that were coming from the devastation of the conflicts. They forged a new path where like-minded countries would stand together in unity, committed to security and freedom. And there has been peace within the NATO alliance ever since. The first 40 years of NATO were about the Cold War, and during that time, our collective strength and solidarity prevented invasion and the nuclear war. And we still have a piece of the Berlin Wall outside our quarter to remind us of the fragility of our freedom. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in '89, the countries that formed the Warsaw Pact actually sought to secure their newfound freedom through NATO. And this desire actually translated into our membership moving from 12 allies to 30 in 2020 and counting, because others are aspiring actually to join the alliance. As new challenges arose, NATO adapted. And after 9/11, NATO invoked the collective defense clause of our founding treaty for the first and only time, the so-called Article 5. Stated that an attack on one was an attack on all. And this led to the NATO biggest mission in Afghanistan to make sure that that country will never again become a safe haven for international terrorists. So what is NATO nowadays, and what are the core tasks of the alliance? There are actually three. They are stated in the strategic concept. The first is collective defense. It's about NATO members assisting each other against attacks in accordance with the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. The second is crisis management. And NATO has a unique and robust set of political and military capabilities to address the full spectrum of crisis before, during, and after, so also crisis prevention. The third is cooperative security, which is very much relevant for the MENA, and as the alliance is affected by and can affect political and security development beyond its border, and wants to team up with the partner nations through cooperative security. So let me now move to what we do in the MENA region, and I also want to welcome today's developments of normalizing relations between the two of what are NATO partners, as I will explain to you in a minute. So despite the tremendous political changes across the region in the past decade, which have made the region more fragmented and unstable, NATO's partnership framework in the south has proven to be very resilient and an invaluable forum in which we've been able to discuss, assess, and jointly address, I would say, common challenges with our partners. So the notion of transatlantic and Mediterranean security are closely linked, and this is very obvious today as well as in any moment of the history of the alliance. So the NATO and the MENA partner share not only geographic proximity, but also a number of security challenges. And our approach is to tackle these challenges through a common security approach. The two primary vehicles to do that are two framework programs. One is called the Mediterranean Dialogue, which started in 1994 with 6 Arab countries, namely Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan, plus Israel. We have a second program, which is called Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which started in 2004 and involves UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. In these forums, NATO and its partners can meet and discuss security issues and common concerns, both bilaterally and in groups. So let me underline how the Mediterranean Dialogue is one unique forum in which Israel and the 6 Arab countries actually get together periodically. They've been doing this for the last 26 years. NATO is also very active in Iraq. The security situation in the country remains challenging, but NATO remains committed to stepping up our support. We have a mission there, and that has the aim to train the Iraqi forces to fight terrorism, prevent the return of ISIS, and stabilize the country. We're actually planning to expand the training mission in Iraq and go beyond the current engagement. Something else that we do, we monitor very closely all the regional crises, and you know how many there are in the Middle East and North Africa. NATO allies are safer when our neighbors too are more secure. And just to name a few of the challenges that we share with our partners, conflicts spill over from fragile or failing states, such as Syria, Libya, instability and terrorism in the Sahel and Iraq, transnational terrorist groups such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda, cyber security issues, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, illegal trafficking in small arms, illegal weapons, migration, and so on and so forth. So let me give you the example of Sahel, where NATO is taking a closer look now. We are, as I said, we have a partnership with Mauritania, but NATO is now following closely what is happening there. Although we are not namely in the ground, several NATO allies, for example, France, the United States, have forces in the region, and we continue to share information and intelligence. All allies are concerned about the threat posed by Islamist militant groups in North Africa and the Sahel. And so we have, besides our engagement in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we also support Tunisia and Jordan with the capacity building. On terrorism, NATO is looking at what more we could do, build greater stability, strengthen security across North Africa and the Middle East. For example, helping partners with reforms and capacity building, involving them in exercises with a focus on fighting terrorism, and deepening our partnership, including with regional organizations such as the African Union. The situation in Libya, let me spend a couple of words on this. We welcome the recent positive political developments, including the agreement on the ceasefire that has been reached. We hope this will enable the Libyans to exercise their sovereign rights to choose their country's leadership and direction. And naturally, NATO is still committed to providing support to Libya under the UN framework in the area of defense and security institution building when the political and security conditions will permit. At the same time, let me also tell you that we are concerned about the growing Russian presence and influence in the MENA, and there are now more Russian forces and bases in our neighbor, from the high north to Syria and Libya. We also see an increased Russian presence following the crisis in Belarus and Nagorno-Karabakh. And NATO has responded to the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation, following the actions of Russia in Crimea in 2014. So let me now move to what we actually do with partners. And I mentioned the two cooperation frameworks that we have. They're actually based on two pillars: political dialogue and practical cooperation. So the political dimension can be bilateral, multilateral, and has actually continued to increase in regularity and in substance. On the practical front, we have experienced a steady increase in the cooperation with the partners. To give you an idea of how much this has increased, the activities have practically doubled since 2011 with our MENA partners. Security sector reform, capacity building, interoperability, the promotion of standardization are key elements of this practical cooperation. So we have specialized courses in our institutions, such as the NATO Defense College, in-country training on counter-terrorism, assistance in mine detection, munition stores, control of trafficking in small arms and light weapons, cybersecurity, maritime and port security, civil emergency and crisis management, and so on. Let me mention a couple of success stories. The NATO Mauritania Trust Fund has supported the storage of munition stockpiles away from populated areas and the destruction of obsolete weapons and ammunition. Our assistance to Jordan has enabled the country to develop a training center for the empowerment of women in the armed forces. We also have support in Jordan in establishing a national crisis management center together with the UN, which played a key role in addressing the COVID-19 crisis in that country. We work very closely with the Tunisian Ministry of Defense in the area of good governance, and Tunisia is one of the countries for which we have a strong NATO-EU cooperation to synchronize our activities. In the Gulf, we have established a regional center. It's called the NATO ICI Regional Center in Kuwait, which has been created 3 years ago and has trained so far 1,000 participants for all 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And our partners are also taking an active role in engaging with NATO. And I'll give you some examples. For example, Morocco and Jordan has been leaders in countering violent extremism in cooperation with us. The Algerians possess decades-long experience in protecting critical infrastructure protection, critical energy infrastructure, I'm sorry. Qatar has offered assistance through NATO to African countries during the COVID crisis, offering the airlift capabilities. And actually, Tunisia has been one of the beneficiaries of NATO support during the COVID crisis. So the list is long. I don't want to give you additional examples, but what I want to convey here is that the partnership is a two-way street between NATO and the MENA partners. So let me close with where do we go from here, moving forward. So we're looking into expanding the NATO presence in the MENA region, the permanent presence beyond our existing center in Kuwait. We also want to better understand how NATO is perceived among key opinion formers and in the broader public to better focus our public diplomacy activities. Also, we want to improve our coherence and coordination with our international efforts, engaging with individual allies that are independently engaged, but also better coordinated with the United Nations, with the European Union, with regional organizations, because we need to ensure complementarity of efforts. NATO is not, I would say, like a primary actor in the MENA region. We are not really engaged in a lot of crises so far, with the notable exception of Iraq. So I think another area in which we can make progress is to renew our efforts in crisis prevention, as we've been doing in the field of the defense capacity building, supporting our partners in being more resilient and in fighting terrorism. Obviously, everything we do needs to be done and is being done in close consultation and cooperation with the partners. And to conclude, let me underline once again how security concerns of the alliance converge with the security concerns of our partners in the MENA region. And this makes our partnership more relevant than ever, because our peace and security depends on also how strong our exchange and cooperation is and can be in the future. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions when it's going to be time.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for this overview. I'm sure that we will get into some points more deeply once we will be answering the questions. But let me now turn to the two commentators who will react on what you have been just saying, the two gentlemen from the region. Let me first introduce Khalid Benhamou, who is current CEO of Sahara Wind. He's reporting directly to Morocco's head of state on the tremendous potential of the Atlantic trade winds blowing over Sahara coastline, and he installed the region's first wind turbine already 25 years ago, if I'm counting correctly. He founded the Sahara Wind HVDC, multi-gigawatt transmission project bridging Africa to Europe in 2002. And together with public grid operator ONEE, he submitted this 5 gigawatt project to the United Nations Development Programme, Global Environment Facility, and World Bank for funding already 15 years ago. And here we go to the NATO, because with NATO co-funding, Khalid commissioned Africa's first wind hydrogen system at partnering universities in Morocco and Mauritania in 2011. So we can clearly see that NATO is not only a military alliance, its mission is much broader in building partnerships with other nations, building partnerships and supporting peace and stability across the Mediterranean. Without further ado, Khalid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak at this particular day when actually the other speaker, Tommy Steiner, is from Israel, and Morocco and Israel have now established diplomatic relations as of a few hours ago, decided to do so. So it's quite a historic moment. And it's also historic because the Trump administration has also decided to open a consulate in the southern part of Morocco on the Sahara trade wind coastline, precisely where I installed a wind turbine over 25 years ago. I did report to the head of state back then, and I had to pursue my activities on an independent basis to make sure that I could reach out to other stakeholders. And that is the beauty of NATO, namely, it's an extraordinary strategic alliance based on values, on common defense. And with that aspect in mind, is tremendously important when it comes to issues such as climate change and energy security. It enables countries to collaborate among each other. So we did benefit from Science for Peace project, which was under the public policy, public diplomacy division of NATO. And so that is interesting because you can now project a system in an energy transition and look at energy diversification. I think it was former Secretary General of NATO, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, that said NATO is the most successful alliance because it managed to go through different periods, the Cold War, after the Cold War. And I think he even had a designation for that. He said it's the Madonna effect. Basically, Madonna, through the last 30 years, managed always to come up with the new style. And what happened in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, we haven't heard much from the new albums from Madonna. And this is where I kind of lead to what President Macron came up with almost a year and a month ago, when he mentioned that NATO was brain dead. And he did that to emphasize, to open the debate on the relevance of such multilateral institution and how it can be leveraged to deal with key issues. the collective security, Article 5, unanimous consent decision-making of NATO is actually its main asset. And what happens is you have tremendous leverage. And whether we like it or not, the Trump administration has actually increased the deterrence of NATO by insisting that more military means should be given to that institution, which was not the case before. Member states were not contributing enough. Now it looks like NATO is like turbocharged, at least. And it's also turbocharged because you have John Kerry. He's now he's the climate czar. He's been head of the Foreign Relations Committee. President-elect Joe Biden has been also head of the Foreign Relations Committee. And, Antony Blinken has been senior staff director of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. This is basically the institution that signs the check every year from the US to NATO, NATO being the largest US being the largest contributor to NATO. And I'm sure that this team will certainly look at what NATO can do in order to address key issues, key strategic issues through these instruments. I recall also in 2011, there was the Nato Reform, which looked at energy security, for example, being involved since 2006 with the NATO program on building hydrogen pilot projects. I was surprised that in fact, it was a group headed by Madeleine Albright, bringing all the CEOs of oil companies. And I was surprised that the outcome of that group was actually to invite President Medvedev in Lisbon and to say basically energy security of NATO is the NATO-Russia alliance. And we've seen the shortcomings of that alliance with the Ukraine crisis. So nothing has been done on renewables, on transitioning, building capacities, and enhancing collaboration in Mediterranean dialogue countries, for example. And so I believe that based upon what we've learned and of the disappointment of various NATO members, that NATO has to go back into its core mission of strategic projection and getting the unanimous consent for fueling actually these strategic investments, strategic alliances that need to be done to make sure that we can address the defining issues, upcoming issues, which is obviously climate change. We see how climate change, development, migration are all related, and the complementarity of NATO with other multilateral institutions is quite striking. I mean, we've obviously provided the project to UN funding, etc. Our key problem was to secure the concept, the intellectual property rights. And through the public diplomacy division, you were able to then secure concepts, having few countries like Morocco and Mauritania that could leverage their position vis-a-vis the European Union. Obviously, the EU has tremendous research programs, but countries in the Mediterranean cannot find the leverage vis-a-vis, for example, the European Union. This is what NATO provides. And this is quite interesting because the program of NATO was called Science for Peace. It is still active, and it was basically realizing that scientists were collaborating amongst each other beyond the Iron Curtain. And that enables, once the Iron Curtain was lifted, to start with effective collaboration between NATO member states and NATO partnering countries. And I believe that now with the climate change issues, that this will be a good leverage. And this is really what I found missing in Giovanni's presentation, is really the leverage that NATO can provide in the Mediterranean countries. It's a tremendous leverage that NATO can provide. And I believe that the first countries realizing that are the Mediterranean dialogue countries themselves. I also want to mention the role of Italy, of Turkey in the Mediterranean dialogue partnership. They were very active, pushing very much for these partnerships. And so really want to have a focus on the Mediterranean from NATO and particularly with the focus on climate change, on energy transition, and securing the technologies that will enable us to decarbonize the future. I know that the public diplomacy division and the Science for Peace program shifted to the emerging challenge division, and then you had a whole set of different institutions. And so it's really, what is interesting about public diplomacy is that you can have people to put people working together on a bottom-up process. I think it was also the Bush administration which pushed into the transformative diplomacy. So it was really projecting the future energy networks and providing a scaled bottom-up process, enabling a rollout of very large critical energy infrastructure that cannot be invested into if security is not provided, if a global consensus is not reached among countries that will provide renewable electricity, countries that will receive it, and industries that can transition into a low carbon future. So I know it's very much focused on renewables and what I expect from NATO, Giovanni. And this is why, looking into the future, it's really that Madonna effect that we look forward to have NATO address, as has been the case in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khalid. We will definitely go back to the issues of Turkey and climate change, because I do see that we have already 9 questions throughout the Q&A box, Zoom's Q&A box. We have other questions going through other channels, so there is going to be plenty of discussion. But before we go to that, let me introduce Tomáš Steiner. We are glad that he has made himself available now after the Hanukkah festival has started, Hanukkah holiday. It hasn't started in LA yet, but here in Europe and in the Middle East it has. Tommy is an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and policy consultant at Sino-Israel Global Network and Academic Leadership Signal. Previously, he was a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy at IDC Herzliya in Israel, where he worked on various policy research projects focusing mainly on Israel's foreign relations. He's a member of the founding team of the Herzliya Conference series. Mr. Steiner managed the conferences from 2007 through 2013. Currently, he taught international relations at the IDC Slaughter School of Government, and he also served as the executive director of the Atlantic Forum of Israel. And this gets him more into the NATO framework, because he was one of those Israelis keeping the Israeli NATO line busy, and he's been frequent visitor to Brussels. We have over 100 people in the audience now, as it's being recorded, so more people will listen to you afterwards. Without further ado, Tommy, the floor is yours for your comments and reactions to what has been said.
Tomáš, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you also to CMED for having me and for having this very timely discussion. I'm very happy to have this discussion together with Khalid, actually a few hours after the announcement on establishing or re-establishing diplomatic relations between Morocco and Israel. A very positive development, something that could also benefit NATO partnerships in this region. I have to apologize in advance because I come across on occasion as somewhat straightforward. I was born in Australia, raised in Israel. That's some sort of combination, but it also, this straightforwardness stems from a conviction that NATO and NATO allies could and should do more in this region, along with its partners, and they could enhance the alliance's strategic footprint. However, having said that, I also have to raise some concern, because last week's report that was submitted to the Secretary General by a group of eminent experts appointed by the SecGen to review NATO's future with the reflection process of NATO 2030 from a Mediterranean and Middle East perspective does raise some concerns. The report, just to briefly recap the main themes there, the report highlights the immediate necessity to re-establish alliance cohesion, a common strategic map of interests, of priorities, a set of missions that could be set the direction for NATO in the future. Now, of course, this is not an official NATO document yet, but it is widely endorsed. And the report highlights three critical challenges: Russia, China, and emerging disruptive technologies. Having said that, a bit more implicitly, when you read the document, you cannot but notice that the southern flank of NATO, as it is now often described, the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and particularly, I would say, NATO partners from the south, are becoming somewhat a peripheral issue. Now, in reference to the report, the report actually starts off with a very clear and positive statement. NATO must articulate a consistent, clear, and coherent approach to the South, addressing both traditional threats like terrorism and the growing presence of Russia, and to a lesser extent, China. NATO must maintain political focus on building up military preparedness and response for the southern Mediterranean flank. Now, this all too sounds fine. And this is a very ambitious and very forward-looking agenda. However, when it comes to the report's suggestion on how to deal with NATO's partners in the South, well, actually, the report raises other challenges which are important, but are not at the core heart of NATO's missions. The report suggests to increase political engagement, training, and resilience enhancing, something I don't really understand what that means, but that's besides the point, to confront climate change, irregular migration, resource scarcity, and weakly governed space. Now, NATO partners in the Mediterranean and in the ICI, really, all of them need resilience enhancing for weakly governed space. And really, is NATO the body to which countries from the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa should turn when they are in search of water or resource scarcity? Now, the question is striking because when you look at how the report refers to other partners of NATO in the north, to the east, and in the Indo-Pacific, it is clearly driven by NATO's interests. Why not the same for the Middle East? Now, I'm not talking about politically sensitive issues like Iran or its proxies, perish the thought. But exactly tonight, it seems that experts and officials in Europe and in the alliance have not realized that the regional strategic landscape is changing and that NATO partners in the South, many of them, are engaging each other regularly, sometimes overtly, sometimes less overtly, on critical strategic interests. So why shouldn't NATO tap into this, facilitate this, and benefit from this? And I'll take an example, maritime security. This is a core interest of NATO partners in the Med and Middle East and of all NATO allies. NATO's main military operation in the region, which the report doesn't mention, Operation Sea Guardian, could be enhanced, spreaded, it could expand its mission, make a difference together with NATO partners in the South. But for that to happen, NATO allies will have to overcome and reach convergence on dealing seriously not only with common challenges emanating from the South, but also on dealing and engaging seriously with their partners. Now, this is not an easy task, I admit. Some allies have other priorities, and at least one major ally has a long-standing set of misgivings about NATO's role in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And I don't want to name names, but I'm very fond of their wine, champagne, cheese, and croissants. But to be clear, this is the point I hope to get across. The items that top the emerging new strategic priorities of NATO, namely Russia, which is not new, but China, and emerging and disruptive technologies, are also important for NATO southern partners, and they can contribute to this discussion as well. And we should make NATO a bit with a more pronounced strategic imprint in this region. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn immediately to the questions. I will try to get them in some packages. Steve Spiegel from United States is asking about the new US administration and its return, America's return to NATO, I guess more focused through multilateral diplomacy than what was Trump's focus. But US, regardless of Trump's policies and Biden's policies, or whoever's policies before, has been the most important NATO member state, and without US there would be no NATO, that's for sure. It overlaps with a question from Afla Al-Rawahi from Oman, which is, what do the panelists see and feel about NATO's policies, missions, and actions would be after Biden's oath in January in the Middle East as a whole and in the Gulf in particular? It has been partly touched by Khalid. I will turn to all of you now, as, if you have any comments on the expectations and what you think the new approach or the approach of the new American administration will be, and what impact it will have on NATO's policies in the Mediterranean. Who goes first? Tommy.
All right, I'll go first. With regarding the Biden administration, look, traditionally, it's important to say, the NATO drive to the Mediterranean from its outset in the mid-1990s, and mind you, NATO was the first to establish a Mediterranean framework in late 1994. And through the 2000s, the United States was not the driving force of NATO in the Mediterranean. So I would not expect that much. To be honest and frank, I think the drive might actually come from some of NATO's European allies, like Italy, perhaps Spain, Greece. But I wouldn't, I'm not sure I would count on the Biden administration for that purpose specifically.
Giovanni, what are your expectations and what you can say as a NATO official on this topic?
Okay, judging from the declaration of Biden, even before, even during the electoral campaign, he is a great advocate of multilateralism. So we do expect actually a renewed emphasis on from the new US administration on engagement with NATO and with individual allies. With this, I don't want to say that President Trump was not a supporter of NATO, although, you know, for many must see him criticizing the alliance at times, but it was more about allies not contributing enough with their defense budget to building the capabilities that the alliance needed. So from this point of view, I think the 4 years of the Trump administration have actually, as it was said before, have the alliance build up. And now we have a target by 2024 for all allies to reach 2% of the GDP to be invested in the defense budget. And a lot of them have already reached this target. So for NATO, it was important also the push that the Trump administration has given to this. About the policies of the Biden administration in the Middle East, quite frankly, well, it's difficult to say because now the top officials have been nominated, so little by little that we start maybe communicating also which policy they would like to implement. But we do envisage more engagement. The gentleman from Oman, I guess he's referring mostly to the Gulf. I think that the Biden administration will try to solve the Iran issue. And so we expect an engagement from the US from that point of view on that front. And we'll see where this will take us. As NATO, and I kind of mentioned this before, in Iraq, we have been actually expanding the mission, embedding some of what used to be US assets. So I think that this tendency will continue. So, and that's actually the only operation in which NATO is engaged currently in the Middle East and North Africa. We'll see if with the Biden administration, there's going to be a push to get NATO more involved in the other crisis, maybe in mediation or a peacekeeping role, or in taking maybe a role in cooperation with other international organizations, maybe under the UN framework to do more. So it remains to be seen. I think we'll understand this a little better probably in March or April, when the new administration will settle in and start developing policy and communicating them. And we look forward to welcoming President Biden to NATO. We hope he's going to come soon, and usually that's one of the first trips of the US president. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks. Let's go to more tough questions. Manoa McCritchian from United States. Do all members of the alliance follow the same goal? Nowadays, Turkey is providing more independent policy in its region, participation in the recent war against Armenia, supporting Azerbaijan. Well, from Theodora Christou from London. The elephant in the room is Turkey. It invades and threatens NATO members. It sponsors terrorism, it carries out military operations, threatening the stability of the region. It buys arms from Russia. That list is long. So how do you deal with a problem like Turkey and Erdogan? And there was one more question linked to the unity of NATO and how decision making is being taken. How does NATO mandate intersects with a member state when objectives diverge? This is a question from Sharam Azmude from the United States. Also, how does NATO balance its very broad mandate with that of other multilateral institutions? But that may be other questions. So how is it with unity? How to solve the issue of NATO unity? How to solve the issue once the interests of states, of the members are very different, once they go sometimes against each other, knowing that NATO is an alliance in which every member state has its veto power, regardless of the size of United States, Turkey, France, Great Britain, Czech Republic, or even some smaller member states than the Czech Republic is. So, Giovanni, how does that function?
Thank you for this easy question. So I'll try to tackle it. So first of all, it was mentioned before, maybe with different words, but the center of gravity of the alliance is its cohesion. All decisions are taken by consensus. Maybe this at times means the minimum common denominator, but it is a unique forum in which all 30 nations, even if they disagree, and at times they strongly disagree, they have a place where they can sit together and discuss respective positions. You can imagine that this leads to very animated discussions and tough. But ultimately, what I can tell you is that the discussion that take place in a NATO forum always take into account that at the end of the day, unity and cohesion are something precious to maintain. And NATO without Turkey wouldn't be the same NATO. And ultimately, with the decision-making process, all decisions are taken by consensus. So basically, we come to a conclusion which is acceptable for everybody. It might not be the best possible outcome for maybe one ally, but when we reach an agreement, it is an agreement that is valid for everybody. It might be seen as a weakness, but it's also a strength of the alliance, because once the decision is taken, all 30 are behind it. So whatever NATO has been doing in the last 70 years has been actually the fruit of this decision-making process, and its unity around the security and defense kind of cogent issues has actually been the center of gravity. So with this, I don't want to dodge the question about Turkey. And but you have to consider that it is one member of the alliance, and actually we don't shy away from any kind of discussions with Turkey. So you will not see NATO taking positions as other international organizations do. They do not have Turkey as a member like the European Union, and that is natural because of the decision-making process and because of how precious the cohesion is. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. Your comments from outside of NATO, from Morocco, on the NATO unity and how you see that situation, how much it affects the NATO ability to react.
Well, for me, I really see the value that NATO provides to its member as well as its partner. I mean, Turkey is obviously a founding member of NATO, and the value that NATO provides to Turkey is also not to be underestimated. Turkey has tremendous leverage through NATO. It's also, I think, the largest military after the United States in terms of troop size. And so you really see the value that NATO can provide as an alliance to a country like Turkey. And it also, if this can be harnessed regionally, it's also one way of reining in Turkey's foreign policy and making it more aligned with both NATO members and also the expectation of NATO partner countries in the Mediterranean, because traditionally Turkey has always supported the interests of countries in the south of the Mediterranean. I did mention that before, and in a way, Turkey is also a voice, could be also considered a voice for the countries south of the Mediterranean. So I think, again, it's also, NATO provides also tremendous leverage to the United States in the region, and so I believe that President-elect Joe Biden will use this leverage in treating with the region, dealing with the region, and so I think, in all counts, it's a win-win situation for all the countries involved to remain and make that alliance as strong as possible. It's been weakened because of obviously some decision and unilateral decisions that have been made. But I think, every country has to win and has to gain from 60 years of experience of the successful NATO.
Well, Turkey and Turkish activities in Libya, Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan are a good bridge to a question posted by Nikolai Surkov from Russia. Could you please elaborate on threats or concerns with respect to the increased Russian presence in Syria and Libya? Are these concerns military or political? I guess this goes directly to Giovanni, because he mentioned in his introductory remarks Russian presence and Russian policies. So Giovanni, please.
The concerns are political and military. So consider that until in my previous job, I was also dealing with defense planning, and planning assumption was that Russia was a partner, actually, until the invasion of Crimea. Russia was part of the Partnership for Peace. We had a mission in Moscow, and we had a close partnership. And actually, we had a dedicated council, the NATO-Russia Council, which we engaged as peers between the allies and Russia. So this changed in 2014. It's as simple as that. So Russia's actions were sanctioned by NATO. We stopped having a cooperation with Russia. We closed our mission in Moscow, and since then, actually, we started looking into this relationship with Russia under completely different terms. So this led to actually, to some extent, some logics which were more familiar to us during the Cold War, like reinforcing the eastern flank and so on. So of course, it is a concern to allies that this Russian presence and influence in the Mediterranean. Of course, Syria has always been, Russia has always been in Syria. There is nothing new. Now we have a very devastating situation in the country, but no ally would want a strong Russian presence in Libya. No ally would want a Russian base in Libya, for example. That is for sure. So this is absolutely unwelcome, and you're going to see the alliance being kind of in a defensive kind of approach towards this expansion of Russia in the Mediterranean. Over to you. Thank you.
The question from Mohammed Al Nasser from Jordan. I would like to know why Syria, Lebanon, Palestinian territory are not mentioned in the NATO works in the region. If you can more elaborate perhaps on the different tiers of partners and where NATO reaches, where it has partnerships, where it doesn't. Of course, linked to this particular question from Jordan.
So you have to consider that NATO engages with nations. So we are an international organization of 30 nations, and we engage with nations. That's why we have partnership programs. So if you look at the partnership program in the Mediterranean Dialogue is with Mauritania, which is not Mediterranean, but Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, which is also out. We do not have a partnership relationship with other countries. So we do not have it with Lebanon, and we do not have it with, remember what you mentioned for Syria, whatever. So for us, those are countries in the Middle East and North Africa with which we do have relationships. So I sit in Brussels and I meet periodically with the Lebanese ambassador, for example. That doesn't mean that NATO has a partnership with Lebanon. It just means that we're open to consultation with additional countries, but we don't have a partnership program. That's why you don't see them mentioned in NATO documents. And some countries, of course, like Libya and Syria, it would even be difficult to find, like Libya, for example, is in dire straits, and we monitor the crisis from that point of view. I told you that NATO has 3 core tasks, the second being crisis management and prevention, if you wish, and the third being cooperative security. So basically, since we engage with governments of the partners with which we have, countries with which we have partnership, so you have partnership security with the Mediterranean dialogue countries. And the others are more like countries that we monitor and with which we can have maybe occasionally the interactions, but not a partnership agreement, and therefore not a stable cooperation. Over to you.
Thank you. Ersin Karacioglu is from Turkey, is mentioning that Turkey is not founding member of NATO. That's correct, but definitely Turkey is longer in NATO than my beloved Czech Republic, my homeland. And it is true that in size of the army, of the military, for example, Turkey has the second largest army. I'm not talking about the capabilities, but about the manpower. So Turkey is not a founding member, but definitely a key member, which Ersin definitely knows the best. Let's stick in the let's still be in the occupied Palestine, where Sambahur is from. Does NATO have any role in liberating Palestine from Israeli military occupation? I don't know if this is meant seriously, but your quick response?
No, is that quick enough? As you know, Palestine is not even recognized by some of the NATO allies. So, but we, of course, we follow the Israel-Palestinian situation very closely. And of course, we do have a cooperation program with Israel, a Mediterranean dialogue, and with Jordan, which is also heavily affected by this crisis.
Thank you. I will now turn to Khaled and Tommy to give you a little bit breathing space. Yehoram Uziel from the US. How will the new agreements, I guess meaning the new agreements between Israel, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, how they will affect NATO's position towards Iran? Or what will be the effect of those agreements regarding the discussion which we have here? What are your expectations? Khaled, what do you expect? How much it is a game changer, how it's going to be used, how it will affect the policies together or at the time once we are facing, again, it's in the question, the new US administration coming into the White House?
I think you replied to this answer by your last remark. It's really up to the upcoming president and his position vis-a-vis Iran, which is going to influence the position of NATO vis-a-vis Iran. If President-elect Biden seeks to re-engage Iran and rejoin the partnership that President Trump has left, then obviously this will have implications with the NATO members, namely that all European partners NATO members stayed in the partnership with Iran during the few years that the Trump administration withdrew from it. In terms of the Mediterranean dialogue and Istanbul Cooperation Initiative countries, the position with Iran, we have probably similar position. We, as far as Morocco is concerned, we have no diplomatic relations with Iran, and that is not going to change significantly with any change of position with neither NATO nor the Trump administration. Again, you have a lot of this dimension which is bilateral. You know, Iran has bilateral issues with the several countries in the region, and I think they will be handled by countries one by one on what stands to take. And actually, if President-elect Joe Biden joins in the partnership with Iran, it would be just coherent with the position of other European NATO member countries that are part of this agreement as well. And going back to Turkey, it's true, it's not a founding member of NATO, but it joined NATO 2 years after its founding. It was, I think, in 49 or 1950. It was the first member admitted after the founding of NATO, for the record.
Thanks, Tommy.
Well, when it comes to the question of Iran specifically, NATO has been rather cautious in making any public statements regarding the issue. Having said that, that is not to say that NATO has not dealt with the issue. And for those who have already forgotten, the whole missile defense program that NATO was closely involved in over the somewhat a decade ago was implicitly focused on the Iranian issue. And in that framework, the United States deployed X-radar-based systems in the region. One of them is in Turkey, by the way, which again reinforces the point that Turkey has, by its geostrategic position, much value for NATO. And I won't go into other issues like the Incirlik base and other aspects of this. How the agreements will affect the relations among the partners? Well, look, this might sound a bit funny, but 15 years ago, there was a lot of concern about keeping, not letting Israel go too forward in its relations with NATO because of the other Mediterranean dialogue countries and their relations. Well, first of all, this is no longer an issue, which is great. And I think that NATO formats, and especially by the fact that many of NATO partners in this region now have official missions at NATO headquarters, which is a rather new development of the past 4 to 5 years, if I recollect truthfully, is something that again can facilitate strategic dialogue, political dialogue. To this date, by the way, the only main multilateral setting of meetings between all the Mediterranean partner countries is the annual Chief of Defense meetings from the Mediterranean countries with their NATO counterparts, which whoever follows this can see, there are changes, but over the past few years, you can see how the level of attendance from the Mediterranean has steadily increased. Once upon a time, generals and brigadier generals were sent to those meetings from the Mediterranean. Today we see a higher level. And I think that reflects an interest also from the region to engage in dialogue and military-to-military cooperation, and not only on science for peace. I'll stop here.
Giovanni, your comments on how important is that shift, how much effect it could have on the policies towards Iran, but basically on the discussion within NATO. What are your expectations?
I think will mostly depend on the policies of the new US administration, quite frankly. So, of course, the Iran situation affects a number of aspects. One, it was missile defense, which was mentioned before. We have partners in the Gulf that are concerned about it, of course. That is another aspect. There are partners in the Mediterranean, like Israel, that consider this being like the existential threat. So we of course, we are very aware of this, but I think what NATO will do will mostly depend on what President Biden will want to do and will want for NATO to do. I say before that all decisions are taken by consensus, but of course you can imagine how strong is the influence of the United States in the decisions that are taken in NATO. So I think the U.S. policy will very significantly drive, our policies in the next 4 years.
Thank you. Here is one particular question to Khalid. Aram Kolujian from United States. How will recent developments regarding Israel and Morocco affect the situation in the disputed region of Western Sahara?
Well, I think you have to look at the framework of United States and Morocco with respect to this particular issue. If obviously the United States recognize the sovereignty of Morocco over this region, it's a tremendous breakthrough, and I think it's been triggered by the fact that Morocco is the first investor in West Africa, has very strong ties with all the countries in the region, and the interruption of civilian traffic and the commercial traffic, I think, has been like a wake-up call for what not to do and what should not happen in the region, namely having a Cold War frozen conflict, which has a track through the UN for resolution, stifle any efforts for regional integration. I think the region needs regional integration. Europe needs to be well integrated with North Africa. North Africa needs to be well integrated with Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are lots, obviously, major investments that have been made in the region in particular. And the prospects for development prospects of the region, namely in the field of clean energies, which I've been involved in for the last almost 30 years, will have, require a framework, stable framework, and making sure that investments and the challenges of tomorrow, climate change and energy transition, can be handled most comprehensively, effectively, and must I add, inclusively. The idea is to make sure that these investments that are made in the region will benefit the region and will enable a significant development prospects. And this has been hampered so far with the status of the region. And once this can be overcome, I believe that tremendous developments will follow, and it will also boost tremendously the UN peace process, which Morocco has been in full compliance with, and looks forward to complete with all the international community, and most importantly, with all the parties that are involved in this dispute. And when I mean all, obviously, it is no secret that Algeria has been harboring and arming one of the parties, and Algeria must assume its role in trying to resolve this issue or this crisis, because the further on we go, the less of a crisis it will be, because the winds are shifting, the balance of power is shifting, and it's time now to join the table and negotiate and see what kind of outcome can we reach, what kind of agreement can be reached in the region for the sake of the development of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and most importantly also North African Maghreb integration, which is, can you imagine, we have a border with Algeria which has been closed since 1994. We keep asking, to open the border because it's important for economic reasons, but obviously Algeria refused to open the border, so it's quite a frustration. There's like two borders, there's North Korea and South Korea, and you end up having two countries which have complementary economies, Algeria and Morocco, that the Algerian government doesn't want to open its border, and I think it's not fair to the people of the region.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes. I do see 6 more questions. Let's try to answer them shortly. I will get now 2 in the package. They go probably to Giovanni. One is from Ünal Çevikos, a member of parliament from Turkey. I apologize to everyone whose name I have been mispronouncing. The question is, to what extent will NATO-Turkey relations be affected because of Turkey's procurement of S-400 system? Is this full compliance with alliance policies? And Radek Rubesh, his question is, he's from Czech Republic, my fellow Czech. It is the question about Russian naval base in Sudan. What is NATO's position? What are the comments? If you can grab these 2 Russian-related questions together.
But okay, Russian because of the S-400, yes. So yeah, you know that the US, but also in general, there's a NATO concern about the acquisition of the S-400. It's more about we heard the argument from Turkey that they try to acquire different systems, also Westerner, and they had issues with authorizations, so they had to find a different solution. At the same time, it's clear that the concern is about integrating these Russian assets into an architecture which is NATO, and that affects the security of the alliance. That is the concern of the S-400. Now, where will it lead? I don't know. It's difficult to tell, but it's a political but also a technical concern. About the Russian naval base, as I said, we concern any Russian expansion anywhere. So particularly if it's on the military side. So what I said before for Syria, for Libya, goes also for Sudan. Of course, it is not in the close proximity of the alliance, but still, we are now in alliance with a global kind of outreach and concern. We haven't talked about China yet, but that is something else we started talking about. And so no matter if it's not in the Mediterranean, it's still a concern to the alliance.
Thank you. Perry Bloom from US. What is NATO doing to adapt its facilities, tactics, and strategic planning to the ramifications of global climate change, as sea level rise, population displacement, etc.? That's for the whole seminar. It's also how have so many NATO member states on a consistent basis failed to meet the defense budget spending objective of 2% GDP? Also for a seminar, unfortunately, Czech Republic is one of the worst performers with respect to the defense spending. The first question goes partly together with question from Khmair Abu Saida from Palestine, directly to you, Giovanni, which is that you have indicated that NATO is dedicated to deal with migration, but NATO intervention in Libya in 2011 was counterproductive and escalated the number of migrants from North Africa to Europe. So if you can somehow say in 2 or 3 sentences some kind of reply to those very, very complex questions.
So let me start with climate change. Of course, we are not and will never be in the forefront on issues like that. We do have, as it was mentioned before, scientific programs like for Peace, and we have been contributing to the climate change, let's say, challenges like measures, you know, with some monitoring stations, for example, in particular in North Africa. But you know, certainly you shouldn't see NATO as like having a primary role in climate change. When we talk about the budget and 2%, yes, well, you have to consider that a number of nations, when they join NATO, they kind of feel safe. So at times this is kind of discouraging them from spending a lot of money in the defense budget. That is why there was this push from the United States to actually revert this trend, and which actually has happened. And now we do have a commitment by all allies to reach 2% by 2024. In any case, what I want to also add is that we not only measure the contribution of allies in terms of money. So we have the so-called 3 C's. So one is cash, which is the money, and we ask nations to spend 2% of the GDP in defense budget. But also we look at the contribution to operations. So there are some countries that do not reach 2%. I'm talking about mine, for example, I'm Italian. And Italy is a very strong contributor to NATO missions and operations. So, and since the rule is that costs lie where they fall, these countries actually support the mission with their own money. And this doesn't count as the 2% of the defense. Actually, it does because it's kind of in the basket, but from a NATO perspective, there's a contribution to operations and missions that maybe other countries that reach 2% do not provide. And the third C is capabilities. So we also look at what nations procure in terms of capabilities that will be made available to NATO in the future. So how well do they spend their defense budget? That is why we have another threshold of 20%. The 20% of the defense budget should be spent in new equipment and state-of-the-art capabilities, while a lot of nations have kind of an imbalance in the defense budget, and maybe a lot is spent in personnel, or maybe the pensions fall into those baskets. And then at the end, even though they spend more than other countries, the money is not well spent. A word on Libya and migration. NATO intervened in Libya, actually following a UN Security Council resolution. So we were kind of dragged into that conflict, and it was to solve a problem, actually, not to create one. NATO could have stayed, did not, because there was a clear choice of the international community that we wouldn't remain there. And so basically we were only a protagonist of the kinetic phase, in which actually from a military perspective was a successful operation. The reason why we didn't stay is because there was a decision by nations that that wouldn't be the case, and that others would have to take over from NATO in maybe stability, reconstruction, stabilization of the country. So we pulled out the moment we were told that there was no role for NATO in that phase. But as I said, NATO has already decided that we're ready to contribute to defense capacity building in various areas. But for the moment, the conditions are not there for us to do it. But whenever asked, we will be ready to step in. Thank you.
All right, we are almost entering the end of the session. So I would kindly ask Tommy and Khalid to prepare your final remarks. I will, during your final remarks, Giovanni will have time to think about his final remarks before I turn microphone to Steve Spiegel. But I have the last question from the audience to Giovanni, which is from Yassine from Tunisia. Is it possible to visit NATO in Belgium?
Yes, but not now during COVID. Actually, I had difficulties going to the office as well. But yes, it is. We actually have a public diplomacy program in which we invite a partner nation, and Tunisia is a partner nation, like young leaders, diplomats, universities. I don't know this gentleman in which situation he is. But basically, we do organize visits to NATO. We explain what the organization is about, what we do with specific partners, and so on. So there's certainly this opportunity once we get out of this COVID crisis, please.
Thanks. Well, Tommy has got a lot of experience of bringing many Israelis into NATO headquarters to see how does it look inside NATO Brussels compound. Tommy, your final word, your final remarks.
Look, I think that there are positive developments on the ground here in the Middle East, which actually facilitate a far more closer relationship between NATO and the partners in the Gulf and across the Mediterranean. And I hope that we will seize this opportunity. True, there will be differences also, because I can expect that on certain issues like Iran, the NATO's partners in the region will find much more common interest, common language among themselves than with perhaps the new US administration. But all in all, I think there's room for cooperation and for a more stronger and more pronounced strategic footprint of the alliance here in the region on military and political issues, also on China, which we did not discuss, definitely on Russia, and also on what is known as EDT, emerging and disruptive technologies. And thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Khalid, your final remarks, statements.
Thank you. I'm very honored to have that last word. I think, I go back to that Madonna syndrome or the Madonna effect. NATO has to reinvent itself, and don't discount NATO and climate change with the upcoming new administration. It's clearly it's been recognized as a major security threat for many years by all staff members, generals from the Pentagon, and the threat is going to go increasingly larger. And so I believe that at some point, if there is one area that all NATO members will all agree is that climate change, particularly now with the new administration, is that climate change is real, climate change needs to be addressed, and NATO has a role to play by securing partnerships to make sure that energy transition scenarios can be rolled out, large investments can be implemented in the region for the sake of the region's economies, for the sake of the energy security as well of NATO member states. And, again, there's been this debate about Germany, it's the elephant in the room, Germany's contribution to NATO and those famous 2%. It's obviously the largest economy in Europe. It will be the largest contribution if there is a contribution. I think you have here, the debate that the German chancellor made by saying, wait a minute, we don't spend on defense, but we spend on different concept of defense. I think this could be a bridge to what NATO could be looking into in perhaps developing a new capability in that regard. But definitely, climate change is the defining issue of our time. And I don't think that NATO will shy away from tackling this issue. So this would be my conclusion on my last words.
Thank you. Giovanni, your final statement.
Thank you. I would like to thank you and also everybody who attended this webinar for giving this space to NATO and actually hopefully discovering that NATO is something beyond maybe the muscular military organization that a lot of people maybe perceive as. So it's an organization that's engaged in political, scientific, and disaster relief issues that engages with partners in the Middle East and North Africa. It is overall, I would say, a powerful force of values, a powerful force for good. The seeks stability that brought peace to Europe in the last 70 years, if you think about it. If you think about Europe, what it was before NATO, there was a war after another. So this, I hope that this seminar contributed a little bit to explaining a little better what NATO is about. Also because the title was Unclassified NATO. Well, I hope that we're able to disclose some aspects of NATO that maybe were not so known. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also do want to thank all the organizers. I do want to thank all of you who have stayed with us and who have posted so many questions. 28 over the Q&A. Through some other channels, we got some other questions. We have tried to answer as many of them as possible. We didn't get to all of them, but I hope that we answered most of them, even briefly, but we have tried. And I really do want to thank Giovanni, Khalid, and Tommy for participating in this discussion. I hope that nobody has been bored and that many people will see it recorded over YouTube or wherever it's going to be stored. So it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Steve Spiegel back to LA. Steve, it's yours.
Thank you very much. And I certainly want to thank the four of you for such an important discussion. And we deeply appreciate your presentations and your highly significant contributions. And I do hope that this discussion will help in understanding NATO in a better way than many people do. And perhaps some of the ideas have a potential for the future as we enter into a hopefully post-virus and era with new ideas. So thank you all, really. Thank you very much. Very excited about this session, frankly. I would also like to thank our amazing staff who run our events so smoothly. CMED has other events forthcoming, but not until early 2021. We hope you won't want to miss them. Our office will be in touch with you as the details emerge. Until then, our very best and hope everyone takes care so they are not harmed by the coronavirus, and early kind of thought of Happy New Year. Hopefully a safe and better New Year. And let me say bye for now. We'll be in touch. Thank you all.